Chapter 14, Generalization. Generalization is the process of applying the procedures and findings of a specific study to other situations and populations. In other words, is this a general finding found across a range of different populations? Or is this a specific finding? If these results can apply, that means we are measuring what we want to measure, right? And that goes into validity, which we've talked about before. However, this is specifically external validity, or the degree to which the results of an experiment can be generalized. First, let's look at generalizing across different people. We don't usually have a probability sample, even though it is preferred. As a reminder, a probability sample is when each member of a population has an equal chance of participating in a study. Instead, we tend to use some level of convenience sampling. Many studies use first-year college students because they're easy to get as participants. So the question becomes, do the results we obtain from freshman college students apply or generalize to junior or senior college students? Do the results generalize to non-college students, and so on? It's important to remember that regardless of who your sample is, people are very diverse. We all have different backgrounds or experiences that affect how we respond to situations. These differences might be something we control for in the study, they might be a variable of interest, or they might just be something we use to describe the sample. But they all apply to the extent to which we can generalize our results. First is sex and gender identity, sex being one's biological classification of being male or female. This is something that's typically assigned to us as soon as we are born, whereas gender is the sociocultural classification. It's what society says are the behaviors of men and women, and these behaviors might differ from culture to culture. Gender identity is one's personal and psychological experience of gender. It's how you feel in your head. When someone's sex matches their gender, if they were, say, assigned female at birth and identify as a woman, they are considered cisgender. If there's a discrepancy between these categories, they are considered transgender. The Center for Gender and Health Equity created a toolkit linked here for classifying sex and gender in research to help with generalizability. Some of their tips include knowing that there is no one right way to measure this, and instead consider accuracy, intentionality, precision, harm reduction, and temporality. Essentially, asking yourself, what do I want to gather? How specific do I want to be? And what are the pros and cons of gathering information with this specific question? We also have race and ethnic identities. Race refers to the social categorization of humans based on skin color and other physical characteristics. So these are the physical differences we see from one person to the next and the groupings we make based on these characteristics. This is pretty difficult to capture. The US Census has been updating their categories for race over the years, and we always seem to leave out different groups of people, and there's discourse over who is and is not part of certain groups. Ethnicity is how a person belongs to a population or subpopulation of a cultural background or descent. This might be Hispanic/Latino, Italian, Irish, Middle Eastern, and so on. Ethnicity is really founded in culture, which is a set of behaviors, customs, values, beliefs, knowledge, language, and expressions of a social group that are passed down through generations and are usually associated with a time and place. As you can imagine, each of these categories are important in research because our experiences in the world can change vastly depending on our race, ethnicity, and culture. However, we don't always know how these differences affect outcomes in research because dominant cultures are studied more frequently. We have a lot of information on white Americans whose families have come from Europe generations ago, but we don't have as much information on other groups. So this can lead to some threats to our external validity. College students tend to be oversampled in research and tend to be more homogeneous, meaning similar, than non-college student samples. College students are becoming more diverse, but they are still homogeneous than non-student samples. This doesn't mean that the research is not valuable, but we do need to consider the sample when generalizing. There are also issues when we have volunteer participants, as they tend to be more homogeneous as well. Those who volunteer for research tend to have a greater education level, a greater desire for approval from others, and they tend to be more social. So there are questions about what the results would be if we measured people on the opposite end of the spectrum. Location also matters. Students at ISU are different from those at NYU, who are different from those at Harvard. People in the Midwest tend to be more extroverted than those in the Northeast. We also have to consider online research. MTurk and Prolific are online crowdsourcing sites for research. These samples tend to be more diverse, but are not representative of the full population of interest. Those who use the internet tend to be younger, live in more urban areas, and have greater education and income levels. And lastly, we have to consider research with non-human animals. While there is greater control, which is great for strict behavioral research, we don't always know the extent to which this applies in humans. We also have to consider how the results apply across situations. Is what we see in the lab what we see in real life? Lab research is beneficial in that it allows us to control for many different variables. But do things still apply when we are in a less tightly controlled situation? Field experiments, where we are trying to apply research to broader situations, are a great way to see if that generalizability is there. We also have to worry about the potential effects of pretests. If a pretest or baseline measure is given before and after an experience of interest, that might bias the results. For instance, if you ask someone about how mindful they are before taking part in a mindfulness intervention, they were already thinking about being mindful before taking part in that. The question becomes whether or not we can generalize this to someone who hasn't taken a pretest. We also have to be aware of the effects of the experimenter. The personality, race, gender, disability status, and so on can affect how people respond to different situations. For instance, the way participants respond to me as a 5'2" woman with a more bubbly personality might be different than how participants would respond to a 6-foot-tall man with a very serious personality. One way to increase generalizability is through replication. Replication is repeating a research study to determine whether the results can be duplicated. This is how we check for external validity. We can't solve all the issues in a study, especially at once, but we can improve certain things in small increments. We can see if our mindfulness intervention that works in college students also works in a non-college student sample. If these studies are all done in a lab, maybe we do this intervention somewhere else, like in a school or at a public park, and see if we get the same results. We need to be intentional with next steps for generalizability and make small changes so we can better identify what these changes are. This is really important because there's a replication crisis, not just in psychology, but in other behavioral sciences as well, in which many original or foundational studies that are the basis of much of our theoretical knowledge have not been replicated. Either replication hasn't been attempted at all, or it has been attempted and different results were found. Therefore, there is an emphasis on having more than one study completed on a topic and completed by more than one lab or research group. There are different types of replication procedures. First is exact replication, which is when we use the same procedures for manipulating and measuring the variables that were used in the original research. We use the same methodology, the same measures and procedures, but we are applying it to a different sample or population. So comparing college students to non-college students or college students in another region. If you find the same results, your results generalize. If not, the results do not generalize, and that's important to know as well. Then there is conceptual replication, which is using different procedures for manipulating or measuring the variables. This is using new operational definitions to see if effects are still found. Sticking with our mindfulness example, maybe you see if your mindfulness intervention works specifically for mindful eating. Or maybe you're testing a new working memory test and seeing if it's still related to higher cognitive functioning the way previous working memory tests are. And conceptual replication is important because it shows that there's a relation here that is not necessarily specific to the methodology. It's not the measure that's important, but the variable itself that is important here. Open science, which is a movement to make research transparent and accessible online, also helps with replication. When you engage with open science platforms, you report your methodology in detail so others can replicate it. You share your data so others can see it, and even run the same tests you did to make sure the results are accurate. And when possible, it's important to publish in journals with wide access so as many people can see it as possible. When information is widely shared in detail, we can better replicate others' results and they can replicate ours as well. The Collaborative Replications and Education Project is a project to support undergrads specifically replicating research to help facilitate open collaboration in science. If you're someone interested in building your scientific resume or vita, it's a good resource to check out. Assessing external validity via literature reviews and meta-analyses. So a literature review is a written summary and evaluation of the existing literature on a specific topic. While all papers start with a literature review, there are entire papers dedicated just to this topic. Literature reviews summarize and discuss findings, point out inconsistencies, and discuss future directions. They are a great resource for an overview of research and the extent to which it generalizes in different situations. Meta-analyses are a little different. Meta-analyses use an analytical technique to allow researchers to draw statistical conclusions from multiple studies of a single research question by gathering data from different studies and combining effect sizes to come to a statistical decision summarizing research. So literature reviews give a qualitative overview of the literature, while meta-analyses give a quantitative overview. Taken together, if we want to improve lives with research, we need to consider generalizability. And that comes down to the extent to which we complete research with diverse samples and share our findings and data both inside and outside of psychology. And we also have to understand that science is a process. Replication takes time and we can't solve all of our problems overnight. For the assignment this week, read the Simmons et al. Article posted on Canvas, then answer the following questions about generalization within your own survey project. So the first question is, in addition to generalizing to other people, what are two other aspects of a study that we should consider the generalizability of? 2, in your own words, explain what a COG statement is. 3, what is a problem that might occur if a target population or the degree of certainty about expected generalization is not specified? 4, what are 3 pieces of information you would include in a COG statement for your project? See page 1126 of the article. And then 5, identify 2 things that could be done to increase the generalizability of your study. This is not something that you'll implement, but should be discussed in the discussion section of your paper. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out.